Hello, today I want to talk a little bit about the project which I've been working on, well, for the last couple of years really, where I've been trying to find alternatives to traditional essay as learning outputs for context modules for art and design students. I want to take you through some of the stages I've been through in progressing this project, where I've tried to look at what they've been doing and once it's been implemented, and review that and try and improve it, and thus improve my teaching overall. So I started off with the problem. The problem was really arrived at through an intuitive sense, I suppose, of the problems that undergraduate students were sometimes having with launching into essays, with realising them, with getting to grips with all that involves. Art students can perceive essays as rather dry in comparison to the more interesting or exciting projects that they're doing in their studio work, which are much more practically and vocationally focused. And the essay has, for art students and design students, some issues that come along with it. It favours those with a strong aptitude for academic writing. It's perceived as traditional. Also, that there's some contextual issues there around the makeup of the student body. We tend to have quite a high proportion of dyslexic students in art and design, and they tend to be visual thinkers, and essays only offer a limited scope for visual thinking to be realised. Essays are based around a linear piece of writing with a very formal structure, which is focused around the response to a central question. Now, all of those can be seen as positive things in an academic sense, but for students these can often be seen as restrictive, not allowing them to express what they really think. And so the search was on for alternatives to that. I looked at an excellent resource that a group of art and design educational institutions set up a few years ago called Writing Pad, and that's a consortium of different educational institutions operating in art and design, trying to share best practice in terms of teaching. And there are things like exercises that one could conduct with one's students. There's all kinds of interesting case studies and ideas. So I looked at that quite closely in terms of trying to see what alternatives there might be to essays. That certainly informed my thinking. Also, I looked within Duncan Johnstone to see what other colleagues were doing, particularly colleagues in design and craft who have started using a blogging output recently for undergraduate students, and seeing if there were things that could be learnt there. Possible alternatives that I came up with to essays are as follows. Mind mapping, that's an intuitive, connected way of trying to figure out what your thoughts are on particular topics, and it's often used in business strategy planning and creative industries, software development industries and so on, to try and get a shape to a project. It could be quite a useful research tool for people who perhaps think by association and think visually. Reflective journals was another thing that I looked at. Again, it's a linear form of writing, but it's less formal than an essay and allows a more personalised viewpoint, reflecting perhaps on relevance to practice, for example, studio, and not necessarily answering a central question, so it gives more scope for a wider range of issues to be covered. I also looked at visual essays. That's attempting to create an analogue to a traditional written essay in a visual form, using visual grammar and visual language to try and make an argument and build a case for something. Not necessarily easier than writing one, but as an alternative for people who are interested in developing the visual grammar of communication. I thought it would be an interesting option. Finally, what we're talking about today, which is blogs, which allow a range of different elements to be combined in one. They have writing, they can incorporate images, hyperlinks to other websites, video, all kinds of multimedia content, audio and so on, and combine elements of a journal and scrapbook and all kinds of things like that. and they're also a publishing format, so that was quite an attractive option to look at as well in terms of an alternative to an essay. As I've partly mentioned there, alternatives to essays allow, to a greater or less extent, the following to occur: a broader process of contextual research, looking at wider issues than just a focused essay question, for example. They make explicit possibilities for visual thinking. Quite often they can assist students in using their intuitive response to something that they're researching or looking at, and perhaps some of their tacit knowledge in terms of being able to express themselves eloquently, visually, using knowledge which is not explicitly set out in writing. Allows them to reflect on the relevance of theory and history to their practice in some cases. In other cases, the text could be non-linear, i.e. it could be written and developed in different parts, not necessarily assembled or presented in such a linear structure. For example, mind mapping allows this possibility. And less formal structures, rather than a very formal introduction, argument, conclusion type of structure, these other outputs allow for a range of different structures to evolve, perhaps more creatively. So we've looked at some of the positive possibilities that could arise from choosing an alternative to a traditional essay. What might be some of the negatives? Well, these could include loss of academic rigour due to woolly thinking, less precise ways of thinking about and looking at topics, an unclear focus, losing one's way in the investigation, potentially things like lack of citations and references, losing the point of the assignment, losing one's way, perhaps taking a broader but shallow approach to research, and potentially confusing or chaotic structure. So how can we reduce the risk of these negatives? Well, I believe this is best done through that traditional method of teaching, which is to set the conditions under which the student carries out the assignment. And I've outlined some of these in this slide here. I think mainly what I've found is making sure that students look at what they're doing in terms of meeting the criteria that have been set down for assessment. This is often the best way to make sure that students do what you would like them to do. I've talked in quite general terms and in the abstract to some extent. I'd like to look at some examples of how I tried to implement these principles and concerns that I had, and some of the innovations that I was trying to bring. Innovations in terms of what I had been delivering as a teacher previously, not necessarily innovations in the wider field of academia, although it's fair to say that these are not conventional outcomes. So the first course where I tried to implement some of these ideas was the Master of Fine Art. In late 2010 I was teaching the Practice Context module. I wanted to look at alternatives to traditional written outputs as part of what I call the context mapping project, and this was designed really to try and open up the possibilities for these postgraduate students to explore the context that surrounded their practice. Blogging was only one element of this broader project, and there were the option to choose from several different possible outputs depending on students' preference. The brief in terms of what I was asking the students to look at or investigate was fairly open, and I felt this was appropriate given the level of study. As far as results go, I felt that generally these were fairly successful. The majority of students engaged with the material and with critical writing and subjected what they were looking at to analysis. However, students were sometimes unsure which output they should choose. That sometimes caused a bit of confusion over the boundaries between what they were doing in the context mapping project and their studio sketchbook work, which is another form of kind of reflection but allied to specific practical projects that they want to carry out. And there was one student who was much more visually driven and didn't engage critically with the material. There were various mechanisms that I put in place to try and support students through what would be a relatively new process for them and for me. I provided tools for them to help them analyse images and get the information that they needed from studying artworks. Allied with this initial emphasis on helping the students and providing a framework for them to start their research, regular weekly feedback was available for me in one-to-one tutorials, which is quite luxurious, but that's the sort of thing that can happen at postgraduate level. So the students were getting plenty of attention and input from me in a formative sense. And here's an example of one student blog. This was actually the one that I mentioned that wasn't so successful. It's very image driven, and although it looks nice, there was relatively little in the way of critical analysis, unfortunately, in this instance. You can see that it's primarily image driven and there's very little text at all. Some of the issues that led to me questioning the approach that I had taken were about that confusion that I mentioned earlier and about the lack of critical engagement from one student in particular, but perhaps that was caused by a sense of uncertainty. I wondered if I had presented the students with too many choices, perhaps, and that I should have kept it simpler and perhaps made the brief too open and too broad, and perhaps that should have been better focused. And I did wonder if some of these outputs were so close to what people might be doing in their sketchbook work or even in their studio practice that they would start to blur the boundaries between what they were supposed to be doing for the context module and what they were supposed to be doing in studio. That's not always a bad thing, but in this case it would make a problem in terms of what one was assessing, whether it was sufficiently distinct from what they were doing in the studio. So in 2011 I attempted to apply some of the lessons that I felt I had learnt and some of the experience from the MFA course to a new course, another brand new module which hadn't been delivered before, called Communication Design Context, which is an undergraduate level 2 module. There was a much larger number of students, 59 in total, and the blog was a distinct compulsory output. So the students were required to do that. They didn't have a choice as to whether they wanted to do it or not. And there was a second output, a research poster, that was also produced and assessed for this module. I wrote a brief which did mention lectures as a possible starting point, but also allowed the inclusion of other kinds of material that students might find interesting. So it was still fairly open brief, and students were given a choice of 3 possible blogging platforms to use. Before looking at some examples of the kind of work that was done and what the issues were, I just wanted to ask the question self-reflexively, if you like, why a blog? Well, a blog has certain strengths for reflective writing, I think, especially for art and design students. It allows incorporation of audiovisual elements and linking to literally the sources which students have identified, which allows that to be evidenced. At the same time, it's less formal than an essay or a review. It's more flexible than a paper journal, with the possibility to edit, revise, expand sections retrospectively on the fly as we go along. And it's also public. It's a way of publishing what you're thinking about, what you're writing on the internet for everyone to see, and that seems an important exposition function. At the same time as being less formal than an essay, it's still possible to be critical and rigorous and use conventions and all of that, but it is less daunting in that you can take it at your own pace, you can write it up in smaller pieces and chunks over a period of time. Again, for the most part, I think that the blog outcome was relatively successful. Most students engaged with it critically and did as they were instructed to use the lecture program as a starting point. However, there was a substantial minority who went off that path and did their own thing to some extent, and perhaps didn't think critically and were more engaged in the broader culture of blogging that they saw around them, so which is mostly about taking content from somewhere else and reproducing it uncritically and reflecting your interests in that way with very little commentary, almost a kind of form of fan literature, if you like. And this is a problem on particular platforms. Again, similar to MFA, there was a workshop at the beginning, but this dealt more with technical aspects. We were trying to make sure that the students understood how to create their blog, and we also dealt with some issues around how to address an audience and the kind of writing that was appropriate. And most of the discussion about themes and what people were interested in and so on evolved through a series of seminars where people could discuss with their peers what interested them, what they were working on and so on. And halfway through the module we gave some formative feedback in a written form. So that was a kind of formal opportunity to get feedback from teaching staff. So I'll just quickly run through some examples of student blogs, just quite quickly, combining some written text with images, video and different elements, sometimes reporting on events and documenting them, sometimes talking about particular exhibitions or artworks which they've encountered, and sometimes engaging in a more structured way with the lecture programme. And so it's quite a healthy mix in those students who have engaged well with the course. Occasionally there was a hint of criticism, so in this instance somebody has written a critique of the brief for the other output, the research poster, which was quite humorous. And some more examples here of the kind of content that people are engaging with, a kind of mix of text and image. Some students, however, did not really buy into the project, and they just followed their own enthusiasms. And whilst we allowed that to a certain extent, and I was conscious that students needed to have the freedom to engage their enthusiasms, sometimes we got the impression that people weren't taking the project entirely seriously, and they were having fun, but they weren't engaging with the learning outcomes that we hoped that they would. And in other occasions they were really looking for the visual appeal first and foremost, and this is a common trap that art and design students can fall into, that they go for the look of something and they're not necessarily interested in interrogating that in a rigorous way because they're interested in the style. Having said that, some experiments that certain students tried for interface design were quite interesting. So here we have a visually led interface which is quite innovative. However, this is also kind of straying away from what was originally the point of the exercise, in that it wasn't supposed to be about interface design. So again, we've got somebody producing a really interesting outcome here, but it's off at a slight tangent of what we hoped people would be producing, which was really more about engaging with the substance and the content of the work rather than its formal organisation, although that is an element. So at the end of the module I did sit down and have a think about, okay, what worked and what didn't, again trying to always constantly improve the offering to the students. And these are some of the questions that arose from that process of reflection. Were there too many outputs? Was it a mistake to have two outputs that were related in terms of formal qualities but had different concerns, different focuses and different approaches? Possibly it was, because it gave the students too much to do, too much to think about, and they couldn't focus on either of them adequately. Again, the question of whether the brief was too open and not focused enough. Also, whether we sufficiently emphasised the link with the lectures. You know, there's obviously a culpability in the teaching staff there. And again, this question of blurred boundaries with studio research processes. We could see that some students were edging towards talking more about what was going on in the studio rather than a wider contextual, theoretical or historical context. And finally, it wasn't really intended to be an exercise in interface design, so obviously we didn't quite determine the conditions sufficiently, and some students got caught up in the look and feel of the actual website that they were making rather than the content. So to sum up, the goals going forward as I see it, having reflected upon the delivery of two modules and having refined certain approaches in that process, I would go forward and refine that further to make it more rigorous and to make it clearer, to help the students more to understand what's required of them and what the parameters are that they're engaging with. And that involves some of these things here: reduce the outputs of the module, look at the brief again, make sure it's more focused, make a more explicit link with the lecture program and tie it in to that more closely. And that's all about trying to complement what's going on in the studio, the practical work of making things that the students are doing the rest of the time, without unnecessarily duplicating and causing problems. Double assessment of the same work, for example. Perhaps I took an approach which was a little too liberal previously for undergraduate level. So restricting blog platform just to aid simplicity and consistency of approach from the students, so that they don't get caught up in the different systems of organising their content. And just asking students to take some responsibility in terms of if they create a very long, sprawling blog with lots and lots of entries, asking them to identify what is relevant and what's not, and using tags to do that, so that the staff know what they're putting forward as they're more structured, as they're more interesting and more relevant pieces of writing and pieces of research. And that's really it. That's all I wanted to say. It's an ongoing process. Things are not fully fixed. The module will be delivered for the second time next semester, and I'm actively working on revising the course content, as I'm now the module leader and I have that opportunity to kind of look at things again and try and fine-tune it. And it's all part of the process, I hope, of becoming a better teacher.